Good morning and welcome to this video on literary theory. This is going to be the first in a series looking at different approaches to reading literary texts, and this particular video is an introduction to postcolonialism. It might be useful if you've just finished your GCSEs and you're looking at moving on to your A-levels to watch this video and have a little think back about the text that you studied for GCSE and how you could take a new, more sophisticated approach to reading them. This video could also be useful if you're already doing your A-levels and you're starting to think about how to apply literary theory to the text that you're studying. First of all, we need to introduce what postcolonialist literary theory actually is. Well, postcolonial critics study the cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Now, colonialism took place during a period of time, certainly in regards to the British Empire. The height of that was the Victorian period, but it happened for centuries before that, and in fact in some cases is still continuing. And it's where one country, one nation takes control of another country, essentially politically, economically, culturally, takes charge of that other nation. And so post-colonial critics look at the impact of that, the legacy of that, and kind of examine maybe the reasons why that happened, but also the huge distress and pain that this colonialism caused the people who originally lived in those nations. So one of the things that post-colonial critics think about is the representations of colonised peoples in texts written by those living within the colonial system. So let's have a look at a few concrete examples of that. Well, firstly, we might think about Rudyard Kipling's writings about India, which was a British colony. We could look at Jane Austen's references to the Caribbean in Mansfield Park. Now, in Mansfield Park, there's not very many references to colonialism. However, it's really clear that the financial setup that the family have in England is dependent on money that's coming from estates in the Caribbean, and therefore that their very kind of nice existence in England, their very polite, upper class, sophisticated life is actually based on slavery. And when you realise that, it gives a whole different picture to the kind of things that they're doing in the novel. We might look at the representation of a character called Friday in Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is entirely written from Crusoe's own perspective, and Friday is literally silenced within the text, and that's a very interesting novel to look at for this. You could also think about Joseph Conrad's depiction of the Congo in The Heart of Darkness, and the portrayal of Othello by Shakespeare, and that's a really interesting one because at the start of the play, Othello is really fighting against other characters' preconceptions about him. So we see Iago's intense racism in Act 1, Scene 1, and then we see Othello trying to stand up against that and to carve himself a place within this very white society. And actually, by the end of that text, the great tragedy is that Othello perhaps realises that he as a character isn't strong enough to be able to achieve the kind of greatness that he was looking for at the start of Act 1. And post-colonial critics are then interested in how the colonised people are represented as being different or other, and how these representations bolstered the colonial project. So, for example, in The Heart of Darkness, a lot of the characters that are encountered in the Congo are represented as being kind of less sophisticated, less educated, less moral than the British colonisers, and therefore this almost justifies colonisation because the British colonisers feel as if they have something to teach the colonised people, and therefore they're in a position of power over them. When looking at such texts, critics may consider the portrayal of these power dynamics. So, how is a social hierarchy presented? How do the colonies establish and maintain their power? Is it through violence? Is it through language? Is it through economic or financial means? Or is it all of them? And what derogatory assumptions are being made about the colonised peoples? And again, for that one, you could look particularly at Othello. They might also look at writers who want to challenge the very singular narrative of empire. And by that I mean that if you look at lots of the texts that we study or we read as a matter of course in the English language, they give a very kind of one-sided opinion of what the empire was, and what a lot of writers these days and what a lot of critics want to do is give a voice to the colonized peoples who were silenced by this imperial dominance. And these writers and critics want to say, actually, there's another way of looking at it, there's another experience of this, there's another side to it. So we might look at Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. In this novel, really interesting novel, Rhys gives voice to Bertha, or Antoinette, who's a character from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And in Jane Eyre, Bertha is brought over from the Caribbean by her husband. She's thought to be mad, so she's locked in the attic. And again, she's literally silenced and dehumanized within that text. And what Jean Rhys does is actually say, but how did a person end up in this situation? What's her backstory? How did colonialism contribute to the situation that she's found herself in? And so Jean Rhys delves back into that narrative, to that story, and looks back at Antoinette Bertha's history and the reasons by which British colonialism has brought her to this very vulnerable position in Jane Eyre. We could also look at the presentation of Friday in a novel called Foe by J.M. Coetzee, and this is a rewriting of Robinson Crusoe that I mentioned earlier, but instead of being silenced, the novel tries to give Friday a voice and again a narrative and an explanation for what the British Empire has done to him as an individual. And post-colonial critics are interested in how such writers break the silence of colonised peoples, giving them a narrative and a psychological complexity that is generally not found in the flat characters of British Victorian literature. And by flat, what I mean is that a lot of these characters in kind of canonical British literature are very one-sided. So if we look at Bertha in Jane Eyre as a good example, she's violent, she's mad, she's presented as being like a vampire or something almost supernatural, but the complexity and the depth of the character isn't there, so we don't really see the pain and the suffering that's leading her to treat the other characters in this very violent way. We don't understand why she's got into the position that she has. We don't know what her family is. We don't know what her background is. We don't entirely know why Rochester has had to lock her in the attic. And so post-colonial literature and critics are trying to give that depth and that complexity to create rounded characters, I suppose, so that we can fully understand them. Writers who not only give a voice to the colonised peoples, but also use this as an opportunity to forge a new cultural identity or a national voice as a means of resisting the colonial power. And for this we might look at the excellent poet W.B. Yeats and what Yeats wanted to do. So Yeats was living in Ireland, which was controlled by England essentially for a number of centuries, and Yeats felt that the original Irish identity had been suppressed by the English colonisers. And what he wanted to do was to capture that Irish identity, to celebrate it, to unite the Irish people around this identity, and to use it as a way of saying to the English government at the time, you know, we are a people in our own right, we have this history, we have this culture, and we can govern ourselves. So Yeats is a really interesting poet to look at in regards to that, and particularly the poems and the plays about the character Cuchulainn from Irish mythology. So there's another thing that post-colonial literary critics are interested in, and it's challenging the literary canon. So in case you haven't heard of the canon before, this is essentially a set of literary works which are accepted as being central to our understanding of culture. So if you think back through your school life, and if I think back through my school life as well, and people in my family who've been through the same kind of education, most of us have studied In Spectacles by Priestley, or at least are aware of its existence. A lot of us have studied Shakespeare's Macbeth, or you might have looked at Romeo and Juliet or Twelfth Night, but you'll definitely have studied Shakespeare probably several times throughout your school life. And if we look at the A-level course, unlike any other text on the course, Shakespeare counts for double the marks of everything else. So you have to write two essays on Shakespeare. You might have come across Bronte's Jane Eyre. I did Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte when I was at school. You'll probably have done some Dickens. Christmas Carol is a very popular one at the minute. It's on the GCSE course. Or you might have looked at sections from Great Expectations or Oliver Twist. And whilst if you're just starting out at reading and reading literature, this kind of list, group of works, canon, can be a good guide for what to read. However, what we need to realise is that it's really limited, and post-colonial critics are really interested in pointing out how limited it is. So if we look at that list of writers that I've got on the screen, so Priestley, Shakespeare, Bronte, Dickens, they're all from the same cultural perspective. I mean, apart from Priestley being more socialist than the others, they're all from that same kind of ethnic background, that same economic and cultural background. And that background is essentially that of a colonial power. The British Empire was particularly dominant at the time when Bronte and Dickens were writing, and Priestley came in at the tail end of that, Shakespeare at the start of that. But all of these writers have a kind of monolithic cultural perspective. And many post-colonial critics seek to challenge the dominance of the literary canon by uncovering a whole range of writers who have different perspectives and different voices. They want to bring those writers who are on the margins of the canon, the margins of this accepted list of writers, and bring them into the centre, or even in some cases completely destroy the canon and say, we shouldn't have a list of works that everybody should read. We should just enjoy a whole range of voices and texts. And again, we can look at Jean Rhys's Wild Sargasso Sea and Coetzee's Folk. These are direct challenges to the canon. These are texts which write against Jane Eyre and Robinson Crusoe and say, you've got it wrong here. There's more to these stories than what you've said. There are a number of key terms that you're going to need to know if you're going to write from a post-colonial perspective. So firstly, colonialism is a country gaining power over another territory. Now, it's a bit different from imperialism, which is where a country gains power over a number of other nations. So whereas, for example, Britain started out planting a colony, then it grew into an empire, and we have the ideology of imperialism as they colonised sections of Africa, of India, and so on. An ideology is a worldview or a set of beliefs. So, for example, Priestley has a socialist ideology, you could have a colonial ideology, and so on. A word that you often hear in post-colonial writing is the term other, and this word refers to the colonised people who are regarded by the coloniser as being different. You might also hear subaltern peoples. This is the colonised peoples who exist outside of the power structures of the new ruling class. So Bertha in Jane Eyre, for example, would come into this category. They have no political voice, no power at all. Cultural identity is another term which is very important, and that's the feeling of belonging to part of a group. It includes nationality, religion, ethnicity, social class, lots of other factors as well. And finally, the word marginalised is going to be really important, and this means the group of people who are relegated to the edge of society and culture, who have that voice taken away. Let's have a look now at what a post-colonial interpretation might actually look like. So I've chosen the example of Hyde from Stevenson's novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've chosen this because lots of you will probably have read this novel, maybe studied it for GCSE, seen TV programmes based on the novel and so on. If you haven't read it, Jekyll and Hyde is it's an incredibly intriguing novel. It's absolutely brilliant. The character of Dr. Jekyll is very wealthy, is very well respected, very upper class, except he seems to be strangely connected with this violent character of Mr. Hyde. And what we discover as the novel progresses is that actually Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. And at night time, Jekyll takes a potion which transforms him into Mr. Hyde so that he can go out and enjoy himself in all of the ways that he wants to, without losing his reputation for being a very moral and upstanding member of the community. And so if we look here at the quotations on the left, now I've chosen these as descriptions of Mr. Hyde that we find throughout the novel, and which are really familiar to anyone who's studied the novel in depth. So firstly, Hyde is described as being like Satan. Then we hear Enfield's voice saying, "I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight." You know, there seems to be some reason why Enfield hates Hyde. He doesn't even know him. He's only seen him once, albeit enacting violence, but there's no particular reason why he should hate him that instinctively. We also hear that Hyde has the presentiment of a fiend, so there seems to be something quite devilish about him. After that, Enfield says it wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. Now, that's a very interesting quotation. It, obviously, that particular pronoun suggests a kind of level of dehumanization there. Damned, again, has that kind of devilish connotations to it. Juggernaut is a reference, I've put a picture there, a reference to a vehicle that's used in India during Hindu celebrations. The next quotation that we've got here, the man seems hardly human. So again, we've got this dehumanized quality, something troglodytic, shall we say. So he seems like a throwback to an earlier phase of evolution there. And then finally, a quotation with ape-like fury. So again, dehumanizing and an earlier phase of evolution. Now, quite often, when we explore this novel, when we study this novel in depth, there's an overwhelming focus on Stevenson's skillful presentation of the battle between good and evil within the human mind. And that's us looking at the novel from a psychological or psychoanalytical perspective, and thinking about the impact that repression and society can have on the individual mind. And we're focusing very much there on the character of Jekyll. However, by doing that and by having that focus, that distracts us from perhaps more subtle interpretations of what is a very highly complex novel. If we look at the novel from a post-colonial perspective, we can see that the description of Hyde has echoes of colonial representations of the other. So that instinctive horror that Enfield has when he sees Hyde at the start of the novel is very similar to racism. Many of the descriptions of Hyde echo racist depictions of characters in other colonial texts, so literary, political, scientific texts. So the use of the impersonal pronoun it, the animalistic language, talking about Hyde as being at an earlier phase of evolution, is all very similar to what we see in other colonial sources from the time. Hyde is also effectively silenced within the novel, and we hear other characters describe him, but we don't hear Hyde's voice in the same way that we hear Jekyll's in the final chapter. So in that final chapter, chapter 10 of the novel, Jekyll gets an opportunity to explain in depth how he's created Hyde, the reasons behind that, the science behind that, his experience of that, the fact that he's torn between enjoying being Hyde because it makes him anonymous in what he's doing in his nightly activities, but at the same time the horror that he has when he becomes Hyde because he's committing acts which are deeply immoral. And so Jekyll gets that opportunity to really talk through his experience. We don't get the same from Hyde. We get some reported speech earlier in the novel, but actually Hyde doesn't have the chance to give us his side of the story. I'm not aware of any writer who has done that, but it'd be really interesting, I think, to hear Hyde's version of the narrative. Given that this novel was written at the height of the British Empire, it could therefore be suggested that one of the themes Stevenson explores is the English population's fear of the other, and it's that fear of Hyde that represents that idea within the text. So taking this forward then, you might want to ask some questions about the text that you're studying at the moment, if you want to make a post-colonial interpretation of it. So firstly, have a think about how the colonisers are represented. How and why do they maintain their power? So for example, in Jane Eyre and Mansfield Park, colonialism in the empire, as I've said already in this video, is rarely mentioned. However, the characters are financially dependent on money from a British colony, and Rochester maintains his power by exerting physical and intellectual force over his wife. I haven't put it there on the screen, but also there's economic power because Rochester has taken his wife's dowry, his wife's money, and he's in control of that, so she can have no financial independence within the text. And I suppose if we're thinking about it in that way, Bertha almost becomes a symbol of some of the Caribbean islands. She's from Jamaica. She almost becomes a symbol of Jamaica under British rule, where it's completely dominated by the British power. You might also ask yourself, how are colonised figures represented, and what does this tell us about their experience of being marginalised? So looking at Wide Sargasso Sea, which links in with Jane Eyre, Wide Sargasso Sea gives a voice to subaltern groups and articulates the psychological pain caused by colonialism, as well as the economic and political impact on those who have been disenfranchised. And finally, just as a starting point, you might want to think about whose voices are privileged within the narrative, and why do we hear these voices whilst others are silenced? And what does this tell you about the writer's intentions and the perspective the writer is coming from? So, for example, a brilliant short novella that I've already mentioned, The Heart of Darkness, the voice of the male coloniser is privileged, whilst the colonised peoples are silenced. And by exploring this text from a post-colonial perspective, we realise how language can be used to maintain power over others. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that these questions at the end give you a little bit more to think of as you're reading over the next few weeks. The next video is going to be on feminism, so I hope to see you then.